Clara Whitmore drove her fists into the bread dough so hard the wooden table cracked at the leg. Flour flew up in a pale cloud around her wrists, coating her forearms white to the elbow, and she kept going, pressing, folding, slamming, because the moment she stopped, the quiet would rush back in. And the quiet in that kitchen was the loudest thing she had ever heard. It was the sound of a life nobody was coming to save. It was the sound of a woman who had learned at 28 years old that survival and living were not the same thing at all. If this story is already pulling at something inside you, I want you to do one thing right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single part. This story is going to take you somewhere real. And when you're settled in, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this little tale travels. Now let's get into it. The bread always told the truth about Clara Whitmore, even when Clara herself did not. On the mornings when grief sat heaviest on her chest, when she woke before dawn and lay in the dark, listening to the absence of another body beside her, the bread came out dense and hard, misshapen loaves that she ate herself and did not offer to anyone. On the mornings when something almost like hope flickered through her, before she was fully awake, before she remembered everything, the bread came out soft and golden and smelled like the kind of life she used to believe she was going to have. Most mornings, it came out somewhere in between, which meant Clara Whitmore was somewhere in between, which was exactly where she had lived for the past 3 years since the morning a ranch hand rode up to her front door and took his hat off and said, "Ma'am, there's been an accident," and the whole shape of everything she thought she was changed in the space of 4 words. Thomas Whitmore had been dead and in the ground for 37 months. Clara had counted every single one of them. She was not counting them out of love anymore, though she had loved him in the practical and daily way that a woman loves a man she has chosen to build something with. She was counting them because grief, she had learned, was not the dramatic weeping thing that the church ladies described when they brought over their casseroles and their soft eyes, and their particular brand of pity that tasted like charity and left you feeling smaller than before they arrived. Grief was administrative. Grief was going through her husband's desk drawers and finding IOUs he had never mentioned. Grief was a lender in Cheyenne who sent a letter 3 weeks after the funeral explaining what Thomas had borrowed and what Clara now owed. Grief was selling the 2 best horses first, and then the cattle, and then watching the ranch itself pass into someone else's hands while she moved her few remaining possessions into the small house on the edge of Ridgeline, Wyoming, that had belonged to her grandmother and that nobody had wanted to buy. She had the house. She had the kitchen. She had her grandmother's recipe for sourdough starter and the knowledge of what to do with it. That was the full accounting of what Clara Whitmore had at 25 years old, and she had made it work because the alternative was not making it work, and Clara had never been built for surrender. She sold bread to the general store on Tuesdays and Fridays. She sold pies when she could afford the sugar. She took in mending on the side because her stitches were small and even, and the ranchers' wives trusted her work, even when they did not particularly trust her company. She was tolerable to them in the way that a useful tool is tolerable. You kept it around because it served a function, not because you had any particular affection for it. You hear she turned down the Henderson's boy. That was Mabel Pruitt's voice carrying through the open window of the general store on a Tuesday morning 3 months ago, carrying the way Mabel's voice always carried, deliberately, like a stone thrown with good aim. "Perfectly decent young man. What does she think she's waiting for?" "Pride," said someone else, someone whose voice Clara didn't recognize immediately. Some women, once they've had independence, they don't know how to step back from it. It's sad, really. Clara had set her bread down on the counter and counted out the coins the storekeeper gave her and walked out without her face changing by a single degree. She had done that walk, the one where you kept your chin level and your shoulders back and your expression pleasant and distant, so many times in 3 years that it no longer cost her anything visible. It cost her something. She didn't have a name for something that she paid in private at night in the small house on the edge of town where nobody saw her and nobody came. She had turned down the Henderson boy because he was 22 years old and thought that offering to take on her debts was the same as offering her dignity. She had also turned down Martin Coyle, who was 40 and lonely and smelled like tobacco, and made her feel like a practical solution to a problem rather than a person. She had turned down both of these offers, not because she was proud, though she was, but because she had already been practical once in her life, and practical had left her with "I owe us," and a letter from Cheyenne, and the sound of dirt hitting a coffin lid. If she was going to be alone, she preferred to be alone honestly. It was on a Wednesday morning in October, when the sky over Wyoming had gone that particular shade of pewter that meant real cold was coming, that Ethan Cole rode into Ridgeline. Clara didn't see him ride in. She was in her kitchen, which faced the back of the property, not the road, and she was up to her elbows in dough, and she was humming. She didn't always hum. She did it without thinking about it, the same way she breathed without thinking about it. And it was only the moments when she caught herself doing it that she felt the particular complicated feeling of a person who has discovered a small happiness they are not sure they are entitled to. The song didn't have a name. It was something her grandmother had hummed, a sound more than a melody. 3 notes that repeated with small variations, and Clara had carried it inside herself for so long that it felt like it lived in her ribcage and not in her memory. She was deep inside it when she heard the footsteps on her back porch. She stopped. She lifted her head. Her hands were still pressed flat into the dough. "Hello?" she called, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was a skill she had developed and was quietly proud of. "Beg your pardon, ma'am." The voice was low, unhurried, and it came from just outside the screen door. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I could smell your bread from the road, and I ain't eaten since yesterday morning, and I'd be obliged if you had anything you could spare. I can pay." Clara pulled her hands out of the dough, wiped them on her apron, and went to the screen door and looked at him. He was leaning against the porch rail with his hat in his hands, which told her something. A man who takes his hat off when he's asking for something either has manners or has learned to perform them convincingly. And in Clara's experience, the difference between those two things took a little time to identify. He was lean in the way that men who work outdoors are lean, all hard angles and weathered skin, and he had dark eyes that looked at her directly without being forward about it. His clothes were clean but worn. His boots were good. A man's boots told you a great deal, but they had seen a long road. "You said you could pay," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am, I've got coin. I'm not asking for charity." She studied him for another moment. "Where are you headed?" "Nowhere in particular right now," he said. "Looking for ranch work. Heard there might be something in this county." "Henderson's spread is hiring," she said. "They usually are this time of year before the cold sets in. I'll look into that. Thank you." He didn't move, but he wasn't pushful about staying either. He just waited, hat in both hands, in the way of a man who had learned that patience was the cheapest thing he had to offer. Clara stepped back from the door. "Come in then. The bread's not finished, but I've got a loaf from yesterday." "I'm grateful, ma'am." "Wipe your boots." He wiped his boots. She noticed that. She cut him a thick slice of the previous day's sourdough and poured him a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, without being asked, because that was what you did when someone was cold and hadn't eaten, and she set them both on the table and went back to her dough. She didn't watch him. She had learned that people ate more comfortably when you weren't watching them, and she had no particular reason to make this man uncomfortable. She heard him take the first bite. Then she heard nothing for a moment. "Ma'am?" he said. This is the best bread I've had in about 6 years." She didn't look up. 6 years is a long time to go without decent bread. "It is," he agreed. "I've been on the move." She pressed her palms into the dough. Running from something or toward something. There was a pause, the kind that meant the question had landed somewhere real. "Little of both, I reckon. Mostly just moving." "What's your name?" "Ethan Cole." "Clara Whitmore." She still didn't look up. "You're welcome to your coffee and your bread, Mr. Cole. Henderson's ranch is about 4 miles north of town. Tell them Mrs. Whitmore sent you, and they'll at least give you an honest hearing." "I appreciate that." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him set the mug down. "That song you were humming when I came up. What is it?" Her hands went still in the dough, just for a second. Then she kept working. "Nothing. An old thing." It was real pretty. "It's nothing," she said again, not sharply, but he didn't push. She appreciated that more than she could have said. He finished his coffee, set his coin on the table. She saw it was a fair amount more than the bread was worth, and put his hat back on, and thanked her, and left. She heard his boots on the porch steps, and then the sound of a horse moving, and then nothing. She stood at the kitchen table for a moment with her hands in the dough, and listened to the quiet come back. It sounded different than it had before. She couldn't say how exactly, just different. She told herself it was the cold air coming through the screen door. She told herself that for 3 days. He came back on Saturday. She was in the kitchen again, same as always, same hour, because her mornings were structured with the precision of a woman who understood that routine was the scaffolding that kept certain kinds of lives from collapsing entirely. She heard the boots on the porch before she heard the knock. She knew those boots. She had memorized the sound of them without meaning to, which irritated her in a way she chose not to examine. "Mr. Cole, Mrs. Whitmore." He had his hat in his hands again. "Henderson took me on. I start Monday." "I heard." She had heard because Ridgeline was small, and news traveled in it, the way water traveled in a dry stream bed, fast and everywhere at once. "Congratulations." "I wondered if I might buy another loaf of your bread." She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them pretended this was primarily about bread. "I've got one almost ready," she said. "You can wait on the porch if you like. I'd appreciate that." He sat down on the porch steps without being invited to sit, which she found she didn't mind the way she thought she might. Most men who sat on her porch without being invited did it to make a point about their comfort in a space that belonged to her. Ethan Cole did it the way a stray dog sits down near a warm window, not claiming anything, just grateful for the proximity to warmth. She brought the bread out when it was done and sat down on the other end of the steps with her own cup of coffee, because it was her porch, and she could, and they sat in the cold October air, and she cut the loaf, and he ate, and she drank her coffee, and they were quiet together, in a way that did not demand to be filled. "You got family around here?" he asked eventually. "No, you—" "No." A pause. "Had a brother. He's gone now." "I'm sorry. It was a while back." He turned the bread in his hands. "You always bake alone?" "Always," she said. "You always hum like that?" She looked at him sideways. "You asking about my humming again?" "I reckon I am." "It's a habit," she said. "My grandmother did it. I picked it up somewhere along the way, and I haven't been able to put it down." "What does it do for you?" he asked, and the question was so direct and so free of any kind of judgment that it caught her completely off guard. She looked at her coffee cup. "It keeps the quiet from getting too loud." He was still for a moment. Then he nodded, like she had said something that made complete sense to him, and she felt something strange move through her chest, the sensation of being understood by someone who had no obligation to understand you. "I know something about that," he said. They sat on the porch until the light went flat and the wind picked up, and Clara said she needed to get back inside, and he said he understood and thanked her for the bread, and she watched him ride back toward the Henderson spread with the heel of the loaf wrapped in her dish towel, which she hadn't meant to lend him but found she didn't mind. After that, he came back every Saturday, sometimes on Wednesdays too. He never arrived without something to offer in return. The first Wednesday, he spent 2 hours without being asked, fixing the porch rail he had leaned against the first time he came, which had been loose and wobbling since the previous spring. He did it quietly and efficiently and without making a production of it, and when Clara came out to see what the hammering was about, he just said this was going to give way. "I had the nails in my saddlebag." "I didn't ask you to do that," she said. "No, ma'am, you didn't." She looked at the repaired rail. "Thank you," she said, which was harder to say than it sounded, because she had spent 3 years not accepting help from anyone in this town without examining every possible motive behind the offering. "You're welcome," he said, and went back to what he was doing. The following Saturday, he brought the dish towel back washed and folded. She stood in the doorway looking at it for a moment, and then looked at him. "You washed it," she said. "I borrowed it," he said, as if that were all the explanation required. And in a way it was. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. Ridgeline, Wyoming in the October of 1882 was a place of limited entertainment and unlimited appetite for the private business of its residents, and a rugged stranger spending his Saturdays on the widow Whitmore's porch was the kind of thing that fed that appetite considerably. Clara knew they were talking. She could feel it in the way conversation changed its cadence when she walked into the general store, in the particular careful politeness that Mabel Pruitt employed when she was working up to something. She knew it was coming. It came on a Tuesday in the second week of November while she was delivering her bread to the store. "Clara," said Mabel Pruitt, appearing from between the fabric bolts, the way Mabel always appeared, as if she had been there the whole time waiting. "I hope you'll forgive me if I speak plainly." "You will regardless," said Clara, pleasantly stacking her loaves on the counter. Mabel pressed her lips together. "People are talking about that cowboy, the one from Henderson's place." "Are they?" "He's been to your house several times." "He buys bread," said Clara. "I sell bread. It's a commercial arrangement." Clara, Mabel's voice dropped, took on the texture of genuine concern that Clara had learned to distrust, because genuine concern in this town always came wrapped around something that was really about the person offering it. "You know how it looks. A widow alone entertaining a man nobody knows anything about." "I'm not entertaining anyone," said Clara. "He sits on my porch. I sell him bread." "People are saying—" "I know what people are saying," said Clara, and her voice stayed level and pleasant. But she turned and looked at Mabel Pruitt directly for the first time in the conversation, and something in her face made Mabel stop speaking. "People have been saying things about me since before my husband was cold in the ground. They said I was foolish to stay in Ridgeline. They said I was proud for not marrying again. They said I was strange for living alone." She picked up her empty basket. "I've been living alongside what people say for 3 years, Mabel, and I'm still here, which is more than I can say for most of what they've predicted about me." She walked out of the store with her basket and her chin level, and her expression pleasant and distant, the way she had practiced. She walked all the way home before she let herself feel the shake in her hands. Because the truth was, the thing that shook her was not Mabel Pruitt's opinion. The thing that shook her was the possibility that Mabel Pruitt was right, not about her dignity, which Clara was not worried about, but about the simpler and more terrifying fact that Ethan Cole's Saturdays had become the shape around which she organized everything else. That she baked her best loaves on Saturday mornings. That she had begun to listen for the particular sound of his horse on the road. That the humming had come back not just as habit, but as something that felt close to what the word gladness meant. And gladness, Clara Whitmore had learned at a cost she was still paying, was the most dangerous thing a woman in her position could afford. That Saturday she let him sit on the porch as usual. She brought out the bread as usual. She poured the coffee as usual. And then she sat down and looked at the grain of the porch wood and said, "People are talking about you coming here." He didn't answer right away. She could feel him looking at the side of her face. "I figured they would be," he said. "It's going to make things difficult for me," she said. "People in this town have long memories and short charity, and they don't need much reason to—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I've worked very hard to keep to keep things on an even footing here, to be seen a certain way." "What way is that?" She looked at him then. "Respectable," she said. "Self-sufficient, not a woman who needs watching after." Ethan held his coffee cup with both hands and looked out at the yard. "And my being here threatens that." "It complicates it," she said carefully. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I'll be honest with you. I'm not here because I'm looking for anything particular from you. I'm here because your bread is the best thing I've eaten in years, and because sitting on this porch on a Saturday morning is the first time in longer than I can remember that I felt like I was somewhere instead of just passing through somewhere." He paused. "But I understand that your situation is yours to manage, and I won't make it harder for you than it already is." The honesty of it nearly undid her. She was not accustomed to honesty that didn't want anything back. She looked at her hands around her coffee cup. "I'm not asking you to stop coming," she said. which surprised her because she had been working up to asking exactly that. "All right," he said. I'm telling you what the situation is." "I understand the situation," he said. They sat in silence for a while, and then he said very quietly, "You're humming again." And she realized she was the three-note thing without a name low in her chest, and she felt her face go warm, and he was smiling at the yard, not at her, giving her the space to have that moment in private. "I told you," she said. "It's a habit." "Yeah," he said. "But it stopped for a while there, and now it's back." He glanced at her sidelong. "I noticed is all." Clara Whitmore looked at Ethan Cole for a long moment. She looked at the way he held his coffee cup. She looked at the way he had not moved to fill the space between them. She looked at the hat resting on his knee, which he had taken off before sitting down, because he had manners or had learned to perform them, and she still had not figured out which, but she was beginning to think it might be the former. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Ma'am, what happened to your brother?" It was a test. She was not entirely sure what she was testing for. She watched his face. He was quiet for a moment that had weight to it. "He trusted the wrong men," he said at last. "Lost his land, his livelihood, didn't have anywhere to go after that, and didn't know how to ask for help." She sat with that. "I'm sorry," she said. "I spent 2 years looking for the men who did it," he said. "Found them. Didn't change what happened to my brother, but it meant they couldn't do it to the next man either." He looked at her steadily. "Some things you can't undo. You can only make sure they don't keep happening." Clara was quiet. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere down the road a door banged. "Why are you telling me that?" she said. "Because you asked about my brother," he said, "and I don't lie to people who ask me honest questions." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at her coffee. "The bread's good today," she said. "The bread is always good," he said. And she felt it again. The thing she had no name for the shift in the temperature of a room that has been cold for a very long time when something warm enters it and stays. She did not examine it. She brought out a second cup of coffee instead, and they sat on the porch until the light changed and Clara Whitmore hummed without realizing she was doing it 3 notes that repeated with small variations. A sound that lived in her rib cage and not in her memory. Moving through the cold Wyoming air, like something that had finally found its way back from somewhere very far away. The trouble with letting warmth back into a cold house is that you forget for a little while how hard the cold was to survive. And then winter reminds you. It was a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks into November, when Mabel Pruitt stopped pretending her concern was personal and made it public. Clara heard about it secondhand, the way she heard most things in Ridgeline, through the particular silence that fell around her when she walked into a room where people had just been talking. She had gotten good at reading that silence. It had its own vocabulary. The storekeeper's wife, Janet Oakes, was the one who finally told her outright, because Janet was a decent woman who believed that bad news delivered kindly was still better than bad news delivered by ambush. She came to Clara's back door on a Wednesday afternoon with a jar of her preserved peaches, and that particular look on her face, careful, apologetic, that Clara had learned meant something was coming. "You should know," Janet said, standing on the porch with the peaches in both hands, "that Mabel spoke to Reverend Howell." Clara stood in the doorway and waited. "She said she was worried about you, about your situation, with the cowboy from Henderson's." Janet looked at the peach jar. "The Reverend is planning to make a visit." Clara was quiet for a moment. "When?" "Sunday, maybe, after service." Janet finally looked up. "I told Mabel she was borrowing trouble. I want you to know that." "I know," said Clara. "Thank you, Janet." She took the peaches. She closed the door. She stood in the kitchen with the jar in her hands and felt the familiar compression in her chest, the one she had learned to recognize as the sensation of a world that had already decided what she was allowed to be tightening its grip. She did not hum that afternoon. Saturday came, and Ethan came with it, and Clara made a decision before he even knocked that she was not going to tell him about Reverend Howell or Mabel Pruitt or the conversation Janet had relayed. She had been managing this town's opinions for 3 years without anyone's help, and she was not going to start performing her problems for an audience, now, not even an audience of one who had shown himself in every way she could measure, to be genuinely and quietly on her side. He brought firewood. She hadn't asked him to. She came out at the sound of his boots on the porch and found him stacking split logs against the side of the house with the methodical efficiency of a man who has done this 1,000 times. And her first reaction was irritation. The particular irritation of a self-sufficient woman who has been given something she needed without having to ask for it. And her second reaction, following immediately and uncomfortably on the heels of the first, was that she wanted to cry, which she would not do and did not do. But the wanting was there, and she noted it. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." He didn't stop stacking. "Henderson's getting more than he needs off the north pasture. He said I could bring what I wanted." "That's not the point." He stopped then and looked at her straight on the way he did when he thought she was saying one thing and meaning another. "What is the point, Mrs. Whitmore?" She held his gaze. "The point is that I manage fine." "I know you manage fine," he said. "That doesn't mean managing fine is the same as having enough firewood." She opened her mouth and then closed it, because there was no argument against that. That wasn't simply pride dressed up as principle, and she had been trying for 3 years to distinguish between the two. "Thank you," she said, which still cost her something, but less than it had the first time. "You're welcome," he said, and picked up the last log and set it on the pile and then turned to her. "You all right? You look like you've been carrying something heavier than usual." "I'm fine." He looked at her for a moment. She could feel him deciding whether to push it, and she appreciated, as she had come to appreciate, that he made the right call. "All right," he said. "Then I'd like some of your bread if you've got it, and maybe you could tell me how your week went." She almost said it was fine. The same reflexive answer she gave to everything. The one that had become so automatic, she sometimes wasn't sure whether it was a lie or just a habit that had outlasted its purpose. Instead, she said, "Come in then." They sat at her kitchen table, which was new. He had not been inside before, only ever on the porch, and she watched him take in the kitchen with the kind of looking that didn't turn into commentary. He noticed things, she could see that in his eyes. But he didn't perform his noticing, and she respected that. She put the bread on the table and poured the coffee and sat down across from him and said, without quite planning to, "Reverend Howell is going to pay me a visit." Ethan set down his coffee cup. "On account of me." It wasn't a question. She nodded. "Clara," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and they both noticed it, a small shift, a door opening half an inch. "If my coming here is making your life harder, I need you to tell me. Not manage it around me. Tell me." "I'm telling you now." "You're telling me about the Reverend," he said. "That's different from telling me what you want." She looked at the table. "I don't know what I want," she said. "I know what I should want, which is not to be the subject of half the conversations in this town. I know what I should do, which is probably to tell you that you've been a kindness and a help, and that the commercial arrangement has run its natural course." She stopped. "But," he said. She looked up at him. "But you fixed my porch rail without being asked, and you brought back the dish towel washed and folded, and you brought firewood without making it into a charitable act, and I haven't—" She stopped again. "I haven't had someone in my kitchen in 3 years who wasn't here to deliver pity." Ethan was quiet. He looked at his hands on the table. "I'm not pitying you," he said. "I don't think I've ever pitied you. You're the least pitiable person I've met in a good long while." "The town doesn't see it that way." "The town," he said carefully, "sees a widow alone and assumes alone means broken. And a man coming around assumes he's taking advantage of someone they've already decided can't fend for herself." He met her eyes. "But you and I both know that's not what's happening here." "What is happening here, Mr. Cole?" She said it quietly, not as a challenge, as a real question. The kind she didn't ask anyone anymore, because she had stopped believing the answers would be honest. He held her gaze for a long moment. "I reckon something I haven't had a name for in a long time," he said. "And I'm not going to push past what you're ready for, but I'm also not going to pretend it isn't there. Clara Whitmore sat across from Ethan Cole in her kitchen, with her coffee going cold between her hands, and felt the scaffolding she had built around herself over 3 years shift like a house that has found its foundation again after a long season of settling. It didn't fall. It just moved. And sometimes moving was more frightening than falling. "Finish your bread," she said, "and then we'll see about Sunday." Reverend Howell came on Sunday afternoon as predicted, with his hat in his hands and his pastoral concern arranged across his features like a man who had practiced this particular expression and was fairly satisfied with how it had come out. He was not a cruel man. That was almost worse, Clara thought, because cruelty was easy to refuse. Kindness that came wrapped around an ultimatum required a different kind of nerve. "Clara," he said, settling into the chair she offered him, because she had been raised with manners, even if Ridgeline hadn't been raised to deserve them. "I want to speak with you friend to friend." "All right," she said. "People in this congregation care about you." "People in this congregation are interested in me," she said pleasantly. "That's not quite the same thing." Reverend Howell cleared his throat. "The cowboy from Henderson's. He's been here. Several times." "He has." "Clara, I want you to think about what that says, about your reputation, about what Thomas would have—" "Don't," she said. Her voice stayed level. Her hands under the table went still. "Don't bring Thomas into this, Reverend. You didn't know Thomas well enough to speak for him, and I knew him well enough to know he would not want his name used as a fence to keep me in." The Reverend's expression shifted. Not unkindly, but with the particular recalibration of a man who had expected an easier conversation. "I'm not trying to fence you in. I'm trying to protect you." "From what?" "From a man nobody knows. From talk that could damage you." "The talk is already happening," she said. "It started before Mr. Cole ever set foot on my porch. It started the month after Thomas died, when I didn't collapse the way the town expected me to, and it hasn't stopped since." She folded her hands on the table. "If I'm going to be talked about regardless of what I do, I'd like to at least be doing something worth talking about." The Reverend stared at her. "Clara, I appreciate your visit," she said, standing. "Truly, and I understand you mean well. But Mr. Cole has done nothing improper, and I have done nothing improper, and I am going to ask you to carry that message back to whoever sent it, because I suspect the concern in this case traveled downhill from a source that isn't as pure as the pastoral." Reverend Howell left. Clara stood in her kitchen and pressed both palms flat on the table and breathed in slowly through her nose. Then she started the bread for Saturday. What she didn't expect, what she had not calculated into any version of her planning, was what happened at the Henderson spread on Thursday. She heard it from Janet Oakes again at the store. There had been a confrontation. 3 men from town, she didn't get all the names, but she got 2 of them, and one of them was Mabel Pruitt's husband, which explained several things had ridden out to Henderson's spread and had words with Ethan Cole. Janet didn't know exactly what was said. She knew that Ethan Cole had not thrown a punch which the men had apparently been hoping for, as it would have given them a cleaner reason to have him run out of the county. She knew that he had stood his ground and had spoken quietly and had not given them what they wanted. She knew because Henderson himself had told his wife, and his wife had told Janet, that Ethan Cole had come in afterward and worked the rest of his shift without a word about it to anyone. Clara stood in the middle of the general store, with a bolt of calico cloth in her arms, and felt something she was not prepared for move through her like a current. She went home. She set the cloth down on the table. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. She thought about a man who had been confronted by 3 strangers on her behalf and had not told her. Had absorbed it and said nothing, and come back Saturday, the same as always, for her bread for the porch, for the 3-note hum. She couldn't seem to stop around him. She thought about the cost of that kind of quiet dignity, which she understood better than most, because she had been paying it herself for 3 years. She thought about what it meant that she was angry at him for not telling her, and what it meant that underneath the anger was something that felt dangerously close to the word grateful, and underneath the grateful was something she wasn't ready to name yet. But it was there, and it had been there for longer than she wanted to admit. Saturday morning, she was in the kitchen before dawn. The bread she put together that morning was the best she had made in years. She knew it the moment the dough came together under her hands, elastic and alive, the starter, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. And she worked it with a precision and a care that had something almost ceremonial about it, because she had decided something in the long quiet between Thursday and Saturday morning. And the decision had settled in her chest, with the particular weight of things that are true. He came at his usual hour. Boots on the porch, knock at the door. She opened it before he could knock a second time. He looked at her face and read something in it that made him go still. "You heard," he said, not a question. "Why didn't you tell me?" He held her gaze. "Because it wasn't your problem to carry. They came after you because of me. They came after me because they've decided you need protecting from yourself," he said, "and I don't agree with that assessment, and I told them so." "What exactly did you tell them?" He almost smiled, the small one at the corner of his mouth that she had learned to watch for. "I told them that a grown woman who bakes her own bread and pays her own debts and keeps her own house doesn't require 3 men on horseback to manage her social calendar." Clara looked at him. Something rose in her throat that might have been a laugh and might have been something else entirely. "You said that. Words to that effect." She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in, Ethan." He came in. He sat at the kitchen table. She put the bread between them and poured the coffee and sat down across from him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. And the kitchen was warm, and the bread was the best she had made in years. And outside, Ridgeline was doing whatever Ridgeline was going to do. And none of that, for the first time, felt like the most important thing in the room. "They're not going to stop," she said. "No," he agreed. "They're going to keep finding ways to make this difficult." "Probably," he said. "And you're still going to come on Saturdays?" He looked at her steadily. "If you want me to." She picked up her coffee, looked at the grain of the table, set it down. "Last night I baked a loaf at 3 in the morning," she said. "Not because I needed to. Because I couldn't sleep and getting up to bake was the only thing that made sense. And when I was working the dough, I was humming, and then I realized why I was humming." She stopped. "Why?" he said quietly. She looked up at him. "Because you were going to come in the morning," she said, and that was enough to make the quiet bearable. Ethan Cole sat very still across from her. The kind of still that was not absence, but presence total, and careful, and real. "Clara," he said. "Don't say anything easy," she said. "I'm not interested in easy." "I wasn't going to," he said. And then after a moment, "I've been at Henderson's 3 weeks, and every morning I wake up, I think about your bread and your porch, and that sound you make. And I think I could stay in one place again. I didn't think I could after my brother. After everything." He looked at his hands on the table. "That frightens me some." "Good," she said. He looked up. "Good. It frightens me too," she said. "And I've been frightened alone for 3 years. It's better to be frightened with someone who at least washed the dish towel." He did smile then fully, and it changed his whole face. And Clara Whitmore, who had taught herself to be unmoved by a very great many things, felt it move through her, like the first warm morning after a very long winter, sudden and real and not entirely safe and completely worth it. "Now eat your bread," she said. "It's the best I've made in years, and I'm not going to have it go cold while we sit here being frightened together." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And outside, Ridgeline kept talking. And inside, neither of them were listening anymore. The thing about a town that has made up its mind about you is that it doesn't need new evidence. It just needs a new occasion. The occasion came on a Tuesday, the first week of December, when Clara walked into the general store and found 4 women gathered at the fabric counter in the particular arrangement that meant the conversation had been good before she arrived and was now suspended, waiting for her to leave so it could resume. She recognized all of them. She had sewn buttons back onto their husbands' coats. She had sold them bread for their Sunday tables. She knew the names of their children. She set her basket on the counter and asked for flour and salt and gave them nothing. Not a flinch, not a glance, not the satisfaction of knowing they had landed anything. The storekeeper filled her order without meeting her eyes, which told her the conversation had been happening in here too. Not just at the fabric counter, and that it had been happening for long enough that even he had taken a side. She paid. She picked up her basket. She walked to the door. "It's a shame," said one of the women behind her. Not loudly, not quietly, calibrated perfectly for Clara to hear, and for no one to be accountable for. A woman her age, making a spectacle. Clara stopped walking. The whole store went still. She stood with her hand on the doorframe and made a decision in the space of 2 seconds that she knew she would either be proud of or regret for a long time. Then she turned around. "A spectacle," she said. Her voice was even. "I sell bread, Mrs. Carver. I sit on my porch. I drink coffee with a man who fixes things that are broken and says what he means and doesn't send 3 other men ahead of him to do what he's afraid to do himself." She looked at each of them in turn, the careful, deliberate look of a woman who is done being invisible. "When that becomes a spectacle, I think the problem isn't the show. It's the audience." She walked out. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached the road, but they were shaking the way hands shake after you've done something that needed doing, not from fear, from the force of it. She was halfway home when she heard boots on the road behind her, and turned, and it was Ethan. He had been coming out of the hardware store on the other side of the street. He had seen her come out of the general store. He had read something in the way she was walking. She didn't know what. She wasn't aware of walking any particular way, and he had crossed the road without hesitating. "Clara." "I'm fine," she said automatically. "I know you're fine," he said, falling into step beside her without making a production of it. "You're always fine. That's not what I asked. You didn't ask anything." "I was about to." She looked straight ahead. "I told Mary Carver that the problem with the spectacle is the audience." There was a pause. In front of witnesses, 4 of them. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Good." She glanced at him sideways. "You think that was good? I think you've been swallowing things for 3 years that would have choked a lesser person," he said. "I think the fact that you said it out loud in public to someone's face instead of into your bread dough is a thing worth noting." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They stood in the middle of the road in the cold December air, and she looked at him and felt the complicated internal movement of a woman who is being seen clearly by someone else for the first time in longer than she can clearly remember, and who is not yet certain whether that is a relief or a danger. "You were watching me," she said. "I was on the other side of the street," he said. "I wasn't watching you. I saw you." "There's a difference. Watching means I was waiting for something," he said. "Seeing means I couldn't help it." Clara Whitmore stood in the road in Ridgeline, Wyoming, and felt something she had not felt in 3 years shift in her chest. Not break, not collapse, but open the way a window opens after a long winter, carefully, an inch at a time, letting the cold out and whatever was warmer in. "Walk me home," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He walked her home. He stayed on the porch until dark. They talked about his brother more than he had before, how his name was Daniel, how he had been the kind of man who laughed easily and trusted too readily, and how the men who had taken his land had done it with paperwork and patience, 2 forged signatures, and a lien that shouldn't have existed. And by the time Daniel understood what had happened, it was already legally done. Ethan had spent 2 years unraveling it, learning more about land records and deed filings and courthouse clerks than he had ever wanted to know until he understood exactly how it had been done and could prove it to the county assessor. "Did they go to prison?" Clara asked. "One did," he said. "The other 2 left the territory before I could finish building the case, but the land went back to Daniel's estate." A pause. Not that it helped him much by then. She was quiet. What did help him? Ethan looked at his hands on his knees. "Knowing somebody cared enough to fight for it," he said. "He told me that near the end, that it mattered less what the outcome was and more that someone was still fighting." Clara held that for a moment. "You learned a lot about how men steal land." "I did. Forged deeds. Fraudulent liens." She said it slowly, something turning over in her mind. "You could recognize it if you saw it again." He looked at her. "What are you asking me?" She shook her head. "Nothing yet." But the thought was there, precise and specific, and she filed it away the way she filed everything that mattered, not on paper, but in the back of her mind, where things waited until she was ready for them. What she had not told Ethan, had not told anyone, was that 3 weeks ago she had found something in her grandmother's house that she had not known was there. She had been moving a loose floorboard in the back bedroom, the one that had rattled since the summer, and that she had been putting off fixing because she was putting off everything that didn't have to do with bread or rent. Under the board in a tin box that had once held her grandmother's sewing needles, she had found a land deed. Her grandmother's land deed. Covering not just the house and its small lot, but 40 acres of pasture running east along the creek that Clara had not known belonged to her family. 40 acres that, according to the deed, had never been properly transferred or sold. 40 acres that, according to the county land record, she had quietly requested from the assessor's office 3 weeks ago, were currently listed under the name of a man called Aldous Greer, a land agent out of Cheyenne, who had been expanding his holdings in the county for the past 4 years, with a speed and a uniformity that Clara, who had kept books for Thomas's ranch and understood numbers better than most people in Ridgeline suspected, found deeply interesting. She had not told Ethan yet. She was still building the picture, and she did not want to hand someone a half-finished thing and ask them to help her carry it. She had learned that particular lesson the hard way from a husband who had handed half-finished things to the wrong people and ended up with IOS and an early grave. But she was thinking about it when she went to sleep that night, and thinking about it when she woke up before dawn, and the thinking had a shape to it now, a direction, and for the first time in 3 years, the thing she was working on didn't feel like survival. It felt like a fight. The second twist came from a direction Clara had not anticipated, which was the only way twists worth anything ever came. His name was Roy Greer. He was Aldous Greer's younger brother, and he rode into Ridgeline on a Thursday morning and introduced himself at the general store as a land surveyor conducting routine assessments for the county, which was a lie so smoothly delivered that it would have convinced Clara entirely if she hadn't already been looking at the name Greer in a very different context for 3 weeks. She heard about Roy Greer the same way she heard about everything through Janet Oakes, who had developed, whether she knew it or not, into Clara's most reliable intelligence source. "New man in town," Janet said, appearing at Clara's back door on Thursday afternoon, with a jar of apple butter and the look of someone delivering news they think might be significant without being sure why. "Says he's with the county. Surveyor. He was asking at the store about property along the eastern creek." Clara's hands went still on the bread she was shaping. "What kind of asking?" "Friendly kind," Janet said. "Just general. Who owns what out that way? Whether there'd been any changes in recent years." She paused. "He asked about this house." Clara lifted her head. "He asked specifically about this house." "About your grandmother's property," Janet said. He didn't use those words, but the questions were pointed in this direction. After Janet left, Clara sat at her kitchen table with the land deed in front of her and the county record beside it, and thought very carefully for a long time. Then she put both documents back in the tin box, and put the tin box in a different place than the floorboard, because the floorboard was now a place that a man called Roy Greer might think to look. She went to Henderson's the next morning. She had never been to Henderson's spread before. She had no reason to go, and there were at least 3 reasons not to, starting with how it would look and ending with her pride, which was a genuine impediment even when she knew it was. But pride was a tool, not a principle, and she had enough principle left to know the difference. So she saddled the old mare she kept for necessity rather than affection, and rode the 4 miles north and asked the first hand she saw where Ethan Cole was working. He came out of the barn and saw her on horseback, and his whole face changed. Not dramatically, just in the small, precise way that his face changed when something mattered to him, a shift around the eyes, a stillness. "Clara," he said. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," she said. "I need to tell you something, and I didn't want to wait until Saturday." He helped her down from the horse, which she let him do, because there was no practical argument against it, and they walked away from the barn to where nobody could hear them easily, and she told him. All of it. The floorboard, the deed, the 40 acres, the county record, and the name Aldous Greer. the survey results that showed the land registered under Greer's name with a date that postdated her grandmother's deed by only 8 months, which meant if the transfer had been legal, there would be a paper trail. And if there was a paper trail, it would be in the county courthouse in Cheyenne. She told him about Roy Greer in town. When she finished, Ethan was quiet for a moment that had a great deal of thinking in it. "The land is yours," he said. "If the deed predates his registration and there's no legitimate transfer on record, the land is yours." "I know," she said. "But knowing and proving are different things." "I know that better than most," he said. She watched him think. Roy Greer isn't a county surveyor. The county doesn't send surveyors to ask general store owners about specific family properties. "No," she said. "He's here because someone told Aldous Greer that a deed might surface." "Who knew about the deed?" "Nobody," she said. "I didn't tell anyone. But I did request the county record from the assessor's office 3 weeks ago. And if Aldous Greer has a relationship with that office, then he'd know someone had been asking questions." Ethan finished. They looked at each other. "He's going to move fast," Ethan said. "If he knows you've been looking at the records, he's going to try to get ahead of whatever you're building." "I know," said Clara. "That's why I came today." He looked at her steadily. "What do you need?" "I need someone who knows how this kind of fraud works," she said. "From the inside. Who knows what the paperwork looks like, and where the forgeries tend to happen, and what a legitimate transfer actually requires versus what a fraudulent one leaves out." "I know all of that," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That's why I'm here and not anywhere else." Something passed across his face. She couldn't name it precisely, but it was in the neighborhood of moved the expression of a man who has been trusted with something real by someone who does not give trust easily and knows what that costs. "There's a courthouse in Cheyenne," he said. "There is. And a county assessor's office with records going back 30 years. And I have my grandmother's original deed with her signature on it," she said, "and a date that precedes Roy Greer's brother's paperwork by 8 months. Clara." He held her gaze. "If we pull this thread, it's not just going to be Mabel Pruitt and Reverend Howell and 3 men on horseback at Henderson's gate. This is different. Aldous Greer has money and reach, and he's been at this for years." "I know," she said. "It could get ugly." "Ethan." She said his name with a particular steadiness. "My grandmother built that house. My grandmother worked that land. It was taken with a pen and a piece of paper and a courthouse clerk who either didn't look carefully or was paid not to. And I have been living in that house and paying on debts that should never have been my responsibility, and I have been managing fine." She held his gaze. "I am done managing fine. I want what's mine." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of 3 years of bread and debts and managing of 3-note hums in cold kitchens of porch steps and washed dish towels and firewood and coffee, going cold between 2 people learning what the word trust felt like when it was built out of something real. "All right," Ethan said. "All right," she said. "I'll need to see the deed and the county record." "I'll bring them Saturday." He nodded. Then something shifted in his expression, something careful and deliberate, and he said, "Roy Greer asked at the store about your house today." "I know." "He might come to the property." "He's welcome to knock on my door," she said. "I'll answer it." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You're not afraid of him." "I'm afraid of plenty of things," she said. "He's not one of them." She picked up her mare's reins. "The things I'm afraid of are the things worth being afraid of. Men like Roy Greer are just obstacles. I've been stepping around obstacles my whole life." She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up and looked down at him from the saddle. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her on her porch that first Saturday, when she'd said the quiet was too loud, and he had nodded like she'd said something that made complete sense with a fullness of attention that still, even now, caught her somewhere unprepared. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he said. She rode back toward Ridgeline and didn't look back because she already knew he was watching her go, and that was enough. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known yet, was that when she arrived home and put her mare in the small paddock and went inside to start the afternoon bread, Roy Greer was already standing on her front porch. He was a large man, broader than his brother from what she had heard, with a suit that was too good for a county surveyor, and a smile that moved only in the lower half of his face. He was holding his hat and smiling when she came around the side of the house and saw him, and something in her chest went immediately precisely cold. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I hope you don't mind my calling. My name is Roy Greer. I'm with the county assessor's office. I was hoping to ask you a few questions about your property." Clara looked at him, at the suit, at the smile that didn't reach his eyes, at the hands holding the hat, big hands, patient hands, the hands of a man who was very comfortable waiting. She thought about the tin box in its new location. She thought about Ethan in the barn 4 miles north and what he had said about moving fast. She thought about her grandmother's deed and the date on it, and the 8 months that stood between her and 40 acres that someone had decided she didn't need to know about. "Of course," she said, and her voice was warm and easy and completely steady. "Come inside, Mr. Greer. I'll put on coffee." She opened the door and let him walk in ahead of her, and she followed him in and closed the door behind them. And inside, Clara Whitmore was not afraid at all. She was ready. Roy Greer drank his coffee, the way men drink coffee when they are not thinking about the coffee at all. Holding the cup, lifting it at intervals, setting it down, his eyes moving around the kitchen with the particular patience of someone cataloging a room they intend to return to under different circumstances. Clara sat across the table from him and kept her hands visible and her face pleasant and her mind running fast beneath it, the way it always ran when she was working through a problem, quick and quiet, and giving nothing away on the surface. "Your property line runs east along the creek," he said. "My house sits on the lot my grandmother left me," Clara said. She made it simple, deliberate, as if she'd never looked at any deed beyond the one covering the house. "Small lot. Not much to survey." Right. He smiled again, the bottom half smile. "There's been some question at the assessor's office about the creek boundary. Routine matter. Some of the old deed descriptions in this county were written without precision, and we've been going back through and standardizing." "That sounds like a great deal of work," Clara said pleasantly. "It is," he agreed. "Your grandmother, Margaret Holt, was it? She filed her original deed around 1851. Clara noted that he knew the year. He hadn't asked. He already knew. "I believe that's right," she said, as if she wasn't entirely sure. "She passed before I was old enough to discuss property with her." "Of course." He turned the cup on the table. "Would you happen to have any documents from that time? Old deed, survey notes, anything of that nature?" There it was. Clara had been waiting for it the way you wait for the punch you know is coming. Not dreading it, tracking it so you can move at the right moment. She tilted her head with the expression of a woman doing her best to be helpful. "I did go through her things when I moved in. Mostly household items, a Bible, some letters." She paused. "I don't recall finding anything like a deed, but it was a difficult time right after my husband passed. I may not have looked carefully." Roy Greer studied her. She let him study her, kept her expression soft and slightly uncertain. The face of a woman overwhelmed by grief who had not been paying close attention to paperwork. "If something did turn up," he said, "it would be important to bring it to the assessor's office. Old documents sometimes create complications with current records. We'd want to help you sort it out." "I'm sure you would," Clara said warmly. "I'll look again." He left 20 minutes later. Clara stood at the window and watched his horse move down the road, and the moment he turned the corner, she crossed to the fireplace mantel and took down the tin box, which she had moved again that morning, after deciding the mantel was better than any hidden location, because it looked exactly like what it was. A tin box holding small household items, hiding in plain sight, and opened it and looked at the deed inside. Her grandmother's signature, the date, the land description with the creek boundary written in her grandmother's own hand. Roy Greer had come here because his brother had found out someone was asking questions at the assessor's office. He had come to find the deed before Clara could use it, and he had left without it, believing she either didn't have it or didn't know what she had. She had until he reported back to Aldous, She gave it 2 days, maybe 3, before the approach changed from friendly to something else. She didn't wait for Saturday. She rode, which was the first time she had ever done anything in this town before full light that wasn't baking. And when Ethan came out of the bunkhouse and saw her on horseback in the cold dark, his face did something she didn't have time to examine right now. "He came to the house," she said. Ethan was at her stirrup in 4 steps. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine." He drank my coffee and asked if I had documents, and I told him I didn't recall finding anything. She swung down without waiting for help. "He knew my grandmother's name. He knew the year of the original deed. Aldous Greer has been sitting on this information for a long time, Ethan. He's known about that land deed for at least as long as he's held the fraudulent registration." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He's had someone in that assessor's office this whole time." "That's what I think." "Then when you requested the county record 3 weeks ago, someone told him immediately," she finished. "Which means we can't use the assessor's office. Whatever we file there goes directly to Greer before it goes anywhere legitimate." They stood in the cold dark, and the thinking between them was almost audible. "There's a federal land office in Cheyenne," Ethan said. "Separate from the county system. If the original deed was filed with the territorial government before Wyoming had county administration, the record would be there, not in the county office." Clara looked at him. "You know that for certain. My brother's land was the same situation. Territorial filing predating county records." His voice was careful, steady. "If your grandmother filed before 1869, the original is in the federal system, and Aldous Greer has no hand in it." 1851, Clara said. "My grandmother filed in 1851. The silence that followed had the quality of a thing clicking into place. "He doesn't have access to the federal record," Ethan said. "No," Clara said. "He doesn't. And if we go to the federal land office in Cheyenne, directly bypassing the county, we take his inside man out of the equation entirely," Clara finished. She looked at him steadily. "Can you get away from Henderson's?" "For how long?" 3 days, maybe 4. He looked at her for a moment. "You want to go to Cheyenne?" "I want to go to Cheyenne," she said. "With the deed, with the county record showing the fraudulent registration, and with someone who has already done this once and knows exactly what he's looking at when he gets there." Ethan didn't hesitate. "I'll talk to Henderson this morning." She nodded, started to turn back to her horse. "Clara." She stopped. "You trusted me with this," he said. "I want you to know I understand what that cost you." She stood with her back to him for a moment. "Don't make it sentimental," she said. "It's a practical decision. You have skills I need." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and she could hear the small smile in it, and it cost her something to not turn around, but she didn't, because there were things that needed doing, and sentiment was a luxury she would deal with later. She rode home and started bread, because her hands needed something to do, and she was deep in it, flour on her arms, the starter doing its work. The 3-note hum moving through her chest, without her meaning it to, when the knock came at her front door, which was different from Ethan's knock at the back, and her hands went still. She wiped them on her apron, went to the front door, opened it. Aldous Greer himself was on her porch. She had not seen him before. She had built a picture of him from documents and second-hand accounts and Roy Greer's expensive suit, and the man on her porch matched and exceeded that picture in every uncomfortable way. He was 60 perhaps, with the settled confidence of a man who had been getting what he wanted for long enough that he no longer thought about the machinery of it. He was dressed better than anyone in Ridgeline. He smiled at her with his whole face, which was somehow worse than Roy's bottom-half smile. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "forgive me for calling without notice. My name is Aldous Greer. I'm a land agent out of Cheyenne, and I believe we may have some overlapping interests regarding your property." She looked at him. "How interesting," she said. "Come in, Mr. Greer." She let him in. She put on coffee she had no intention of drinking. She sat across the table from him and listened to him explain with the smooth patience of a man who has done this many times that there was some confusion in the county records regarding the Eastern Creek boundary of her property, and that he had an interest in the parcels along that creek, and that it might be mutually beneficial for them to come to an arrangement. "What kind of arrangement?" she said. "I'd be willing to compensate you for a formal transfer," he said. "Fair market value for the lot, including the house. You'd be in a stronger financial position, free of the burdens of maintaining a property alone." He paused, and the pause was carefully weighted. "I understand your circumstances have been difficult since your husband passed. This would give you a fresh start somewhere." Somewhere. Not Ridgeline, not the house her grandmother built. Somewhere he hadn't already bought. "That's very generous," Clara said. She said it the way she said everything she didn't mean pleasantly, without heat giving him no surface to push against. "I'll need to think about it." "Of course." He set a card on the table between them. "I'll be in Ridgeline for a few days. I'd encourage you not to wait too long. This kind of offer doesn't stay open." After he was gone, Clara sat at her table and looked at his card and felt the first real thread of fear move through her. Not the sharp kind, not panic, but the low, cold kind that comes when you understand the full size of the thing you're standing against. Aldous Greer had not come here in person because he was worried. He had come because he was accelerating. Roy's visit hadn't given him what he needed, so now the principal had arrived, which meant the timeline was collapsing. She sent a message to Ethan through the Henderson boy who came to buy bread on Thursdays. He was at her back door by nightfall. She told him about Aldous Greer. He listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was how he listened when things were serious. Completely, still nothing moving in his face except the eyes taking it all in before he said anything. "He's pushing," Ethan said when she finished. "He's scared," Clara said. "If he were confident, he'd let Roy handle it. He came himself because he thinks someone is moving against him, and he wants to look at the situation directly. Or he knows about the trip to Cheyenne." She hadn't thought of that. "Henderson's hand. The one I sent the note with." "I don't think the boy would say anything," Ethan said. "But someone saw you ride to Henderson's this morning. In this town, that's enough." They looked at each other across the kitchen table. "We need to leave for Cheyenne sooner than we planned," Clara said. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "That's fast." "He moves fast," Ethan said. "We already know that." He paused. "You need to tell someone you trust where the deed is, in case something happens on the road." "Janet Oakes," Clara said immediately. "Tell her tonight. Don't write it down, just tell her." She nodded. Then something crossed his face that she hadn't seen before. A tension around the jaw, a quality of restraint, like a man holding back something with deliberate effort. "What?" she said. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. "And I should have told you sooner." She went very still. "Tell me." He looked at his hands on the table. "Aldous Greer. I know that name. Not from your situation. From before." He looked up at her. "Two of the three men who took my brother's land. The ones who left the territory before I could finish building the case." He held her gaze. "One of them filed paperwork under a different name. But the method was the same. The forged transfer, the fraudulent lien, the man in the assessor's office." He stopped. "I've been looking at land records in 3 counties for 4 years, looking for the same pattern. I came to Ridgeline because the pattern showed up here." Clara sat across from him and understood several things at once, in the rapid and disorienting way that understanding sometimes arrived all together, not in order like a hand of cards laid down at once, rather than one by one. He had not come to Ridgeline by accident. He had not come to Henderson's spread because there happened to be work. He had been following Aldous Greer, the bread, the porch, the Saturdays. She had to know if any of it she had to ask. She had to ask right now before another second passed. "Ethan." Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "Did you know about my grandmother's land when you came here?" "No," he said, and he said it fast and clear and straight into her eyes. "I knew Greer was operating in this county. I didn't know about your grandmother's deed until you told me. I came to Henderson's because it was a legitimate job that put me close enough to watch Greer's pattern." He paused. "I came back to your porch on that second Saturday because of your bread and your porch and that sound you make, and none of that had anything to do with Aldous Greer." She looked at him. She was very good at reading people had made it a survival skill, and she read him now with everything she had. She believed him. She believed him, and the believing of it was both a relief and a kind of vertigo, the way it feels to trust the ground after a long time of not trusting it. "You were going to go to Cheyenne anyway," she said. "Before I came to you." "I was working up to it," he said. "Your deed makes the case significantly stronger. What I had was pattern evidence. What you have is primary documentation of a specific fraudulent transfer." He held her gaze. "Clara, your grandmother's 40 acres isn't the only land Greer has taken this way. If we go to the federal land office with your deed and my documentation from 3 counties, we're not just recovering your property. We're building a case that takes him apart entirely," she said. "Yes." The silence had a different quality now. Not the warm kitchen silence of bread and coffee and 2 people learning each other. Something larger and colder and more consequential. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she said. "Because when I came to your porch the first time I was a stranger asking for bread," he said. "And by the time I understood what you meant to me, I was afraid that telling you would make everything we'd built look like something it wasn't." She held very still. "And what is it?" "What we built," he said, "is real, every bit of it, independent of Aldous Greer or my brother or your grandmother's 40 acres. He didn't reach for her hand. He just held her gaze. "But I understand if knowing it changes things for you." Clara Whitmore sat in her kitchen in her grandmother's house on land that had been taken from her family with a pen and a lie, and looked at the man across the table from her and made a decision in the way she made all her real decisions. Not quickly, not emotionally, but from the place in her chest where the things that were genuinely true lived underneath all the managing and the bread and the 3-note hum. "Nothing has changed," she said. Something moved through his face. "Clara, we leave at first light," she said. "And tonight I'm going to Janet Oaks." She stood. "And right now I'm going to finish my bread because I started it this morning and I'm not leaving it half done." She went back to the kitchen table and put her hands in the dough and felt his presence at the table behind her, steady and real and not going anywhere, and the hum started without her meaning it. To 3 notes, quiet, the sound that lived in her rib cage, and she didn't stop it. She was still humming when the knock came at her front door. Hard. The kind of knock that doesn't apologize for itself. Ethan was on his feet before she lifted her hands from the dough. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door and opened it. And it was not Aldous Greer this time. And it was not Roy. And it was not anyone she had been expecting. It was Mabel Pruitt's husband, and standing behind him were 2 men she didn't recognize, and behind them at the edge of her property, sitting on a horse with the ease of a man who owned everything he looked at, was Aldous Greer. Warren Pruitt looked at her with something on his face that was not quite guilt and not quite satisfaction, and settled somewhere in the ugly middle between them. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "Mr. Greer has some legal questions regarding your property, and he's asked us to witness the conversation." Clara stood in her doorway and held the frame on both sides and did not step back. "Legal questions," she said. "That's right. This is my home," she said, "and it is nearly dark, and I don't conduct legal conversations on my doorstep with witnesses I didn't invite." She looked past Warren Pruitt to Aldous Greer on his horse. "If Mr. Greer has legal questions, he can put them in writing and send them to the county courthouse, and I will respond through the appropriate channels." "Mrs. Whitmore," Warren started. "Good night, Warren," she said. She closed the door. She put her back against it and listened to her own heartbeat for 1 second, 2, 3, and then Ethan was beside her, close but not touching, and his voice was very low and very even. "The back door," he said. "Now." "I know," she said. They moved. They went out the back door into the cold dark, and Clara had the tin box under her arm before Ethan had finished saying the word now, because she had been thinking about this moment, not hoping for it, not expecting it, but thinking about it the way she thought about everything that mattered since the afternoon she first understood what Aldous Greer was. "Janet's house," she said. "It's 3 blocks." I know where Janet lives." They moved fast and quiet, through the back of the property, away from the road where Greer's horse was still audible. She could hear it shifting the creak of leather and into the gap between houses that Clara had been using as a shortcut since she was old enough to run errands for her grandmother. She knew every board, every fence post, every dog that would bark, and everyone that wouldn't. Ethan stayed at her shoulder and didn't ask questions, which was exactly right. Janet Oakes opened her back door before they knocked because Janet had seen things from her kitchen window, and Janet was smarter than most people in Ridgeline gave her credit for. "I saw Greer's men at your house," Janet said. She was already pulling them inside. "I need you to hold something for me," Clara said, and put the tin box on Janet's kitchen table. "The deed is inside. If anything happens to me before I get back from Cheyenne, nothing is going to happen to you," Janet said with a firmness that surprised them both. "If it does," Clara said, "take it to the federal land office in Cheyenne, not the county assessor, federal. Tell them Aldous Greer filed a fraudulent registration against a territorial deed dated 1851, and that the original is in their records under Margaret Holt." Janet looked at her, then at Ethan, then back at Clara. "You're going to beat him?" "Yes," Clara said. "But I need to know the deed is safe first." Janet put her hand over the tin box. "Go," she said. They left before first light. The ride to Cheyenne took the better part of 2 days, which meant 2 days of cold road and camp stops and the kind of conversation that happens between people when there is nothing left to perform for anyone. No town watching, no porch to sit on, no bread to make. Just the long, honest miles and the Wyoming sky going from black to gray to pale gold and back to black again. Clara had not traveled this road since before Thomas died. She had not traveled any road really in 3 years. She had been so focused on the small geography of survival, the kitchen, the store, the church, the 4 miles to Henderson's, that she had ridden twice now that she had forgotten what it felt like to move through the world with intention. It felt like something she recognized, something she had buried and stopped grieving because she couldn't afford the grief. "Tell me about Daniel," she said on the second morning, while the horses moved through the cold at their own pace. "Before." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He laughed too easy and trusted too much and made the best coffee I ever had outside of your kitchen," he said. "He wanted a small ranch and a good dog and enough quiet to hear himself think." A pause. "He had all of it for about 3 years before Greer's men found him." "How did they find him?" "Same way they find all of them," Ethan said. "He had something worth taking, and not enough people around him to make taking it costly." Clara looked at the road ahead. "You've been making it costly." "Trying to," he said. 4 years of it. 3 counties. 14 families I know of who lost land to Greer's method." He glanced at her. "Your grandmother's 40 acres is the 15th. 15 families." She held that number. "And the federal land office. The agent there is a man named Arthur Briggs," Ethan said. "He worked with me on my brother's case. He's the one who told me about the pattern in other counties. He's been building a federal file on Greer for 2 years, waiting for someone to bring him primary documentation of a specific transfer." Clara turned to look at him fully. "He's been waiting." "For what you have in that tin box at Janet's kitchen," Ethan said. The silence that followed had the weight of something enormous and quiet, the way a river is enormous and quiet, until you are standing at its edge and understand the size of what is moving. "Why didn't you go find another deed?" she said. "In 3 counties, 14 families." "I tried," he said. "Most of them didn't know what they had until after it was gone. The ones who kept records didn't keep originals. Greer is careful. He doesn't move until the original documentation is either destroyed or inaccessible." He looked at her steadily. "Your grandmother filed with the territorial government before county administration existed. Greer couldn't touch the federal record. He could only register his fraudulent claim at the county level and hope nobody with the original ever thought to compare the two. He didn't expect a widow going through a loose floorboard," Clara said. "No," Ethan said. "He did not. They reached Cheyenne on the afternoon of the second day, and Arthur Briggs was exactly what a federal land agent who had been fighting Aldous Greer for 2 years looked like, tired around still when Ethan set Clara's grandmother's deed on his desk alongside the county record showing the fraudulent registration and 2 years of pattern documentation from 3 counties. Briggs looked at the deed for a long time. He looked at the date. He looked at Margaret Holt's signature. He looked up at Clara. "You found this in the house," he said. "Under a floorboard," she said. "Roy Greer came to ask if you had documents." "He did. I told him I didn't recall finding anything." Briggs looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing something. "Mrs. Whitmore, this is the document I have been waiting for 2 years." "I know," she said. Mr. Cole explained the situation. Briggs looked at Ethan. Something passed between them, the shorthand of men who have been working toward the same thing from different angles. Then Briggs looked back at Clara. "The land is yours," he said, "without question. The federal record shows your grandmother's filing as the primary and controlling document. The county registration is superseded, and given the absence of any legitimate transfer constitutes fraud." He paused. "With this and Cole's documentation from the other counties, I can take Greer before a federal judge." "How long?" Ethan said. "I can have a federal warrant issued within the week," Briggs said. "Greer won't be able to run far enough." Clara sat in the chair across from Arthur Briggs's desk and felt something she had not felt since she was young enough to believe the world sometimes gave things back the particular relief of a fight that has been worth fighting. It didn't make her light. It made her solid. Grounded in a way that 3 years of managing had not been able to give her, because managing was about staying upright, and this was about being right. "There are 14 other families," she said. Briggs looked at her. "We know about several of them." "Ethan has documentation on all 14, she said. "I want them included in whatever case you build. My 40 acres is not the only thing that needs to come back to where it belongs." Briggs looked at Ethan again. Ethan said nothing, just held the man's gaze, and Clara understood that this was what he had been carrying for 4 years. Not just his brother's land, not just the pattern evidence, but the weight of 14 families he hadn't been able to fully help yet, waiting for the piece that would make the whole case hold. "All 14, Briggs said. "Yes, ma'am." They rode back to Ridgeline the next morning. Clara had expected to feel tired on the return trip. She was tired. Her body knew the miles and the cold, and the 2 nights of broken camp sleep. But underneath the tiredness was something alert and clean, the way air feels after a hard rain, when everything has been washed to its true color. She was thinking about bread. Not the survival bread, not the grief bread, not the 3 years of managing bread that came out dense on bad mornings and soft on the mornings she almost let herself hope. She was thinking about bread made in a kitchen that was genuinely hers on land, that was genuinely hers for reasons that had nothing to do with staying upright and everything to do with choosing to. "You're humming," Ethan said. She hadn't realized. "Habit," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I know." And then, after a moment, Clara. "When this is finished, when Briggs has his warrant and Greer is dealt with and your grandmother's land is back in your name," he paused. "I want to ask you something." "Ask it now," she said. "I don't like waiting." She heard him take a breath. "I've been moving for 4 years because I didn't have a reason to stop. And then I stopped at your kitchen door because I smelled your bread, which is the most ridiculous reason a man ever stopped anywhere. And everything that came after that was the least ridiculous thing that has happened to me in as long as I can remember." He kept his eyes on the road. "I'm not a drifter with good intentions anymore, Clara. I'm a man who would like, if you'll have it, to stop moving permanently. In Ridgeline. Close to your porch. A beat. Closer than your porch, if you'll permit it." Clara looked at the road ahead. She felt the 3-note hum in her chest, the one that had come back and stayed back and stopped being a habit and started being something she didn't have a word for except true. "Finish helping me get my land back first," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And fix the back porch step. It's been loose for 2 months." "I'll fix it Saturday." "And then," she said, "we'll talk about closer than the porch." She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She could feel the warmth of him beside her on the cold road, solid and unhurried and real, and she let it be exactly what it was. They came back into Ridgeline on a Friday afternoon, and the town saw them ride in together, which Clara had known it would, and had decided somewhere on the Cheyenne Road that she did not care about in the way she used to care about it. Not because she had stopped being a person who understood the consequences of public perception, but because she had rebuilt the scale she measured those consequences on, and Ridgeline's opinion of her life had dropped to the lower end of it. Aldous Greer was still in town. She had expected that. He was a man who pressed his advantages, and he had not yet understood that the advantage had shifted. She found out on Saturday morning that he had been to see Warren Pruitt again, and that the two of them had been at the county courthouse with papers she didn't have full details on yet. She found out from Janet, who came to the back door early, before Ethan arrived, with the look of someone who has been up since before dawn doing something useful. "I listened," Janet said simply. "At the courthouse yesterday when Greer's man filed. I know the clerk. He told me what was in it." Clara looked at her. "What was it?" "A petition to have the property assessed as abandoned and transferred into county custody," Janet said, "on the grounds that the current occupant has no documented claim." Janet's chin was up, her eyes bright with the particular fury of a decent woman who has reached her limit. "He's trying to pull the house out from under you while you were in Cheyenne." Clara felt something go cold and precise inside her. Not fear, clarity. "When does it go before the county judge?" "Monday," Janet said. 2 days. Ethan arrived an hour later, and she told him, and he sat at the kitchen table with the stillness that meant he was thinking fast and hard, and not showing the speed of it. "Briggs can't get a federal warrant processed before Monday," he said. "I know," Clara said. "But a federal warrant isn't what we need for Monday." He looked at her. "What we need is the federal land record showing your grandmother's prior filing. Briggs can telegraph a certified copy of the territorial record to the Cheyenne County Telegraph Office. It's admissible as a federal document." He paused. "If we have that copy in hand before Monday morning, we walk into that county courtroom, and Greer's petition collapses the moment the judge sees a federal territorial deed, predating his client's registration by 18 years. Can Briggs get that copy by Sunday?" "I'll send him a telegram this morning." She looked at him. "Go. Now." He went. Clara spent Saturday doing what she did when she needed to hold herself steady. She baked. Not because she was afraid, not because the quiet was too loud, but because the bread needed doing and her hands needed work. And there was a particular rightness to being in her grandmother's kitchen on her grandmother's land. Making the thing she made best on the day before she went to a courthouse and proved that this place had always been hers. The telegram from Briggs arrived Sunday morning. The certified copy of the territorial land record. Margaret Holt's original 1851 filing, authenticated with the federal seal of the Territorial Land Office, came through the telegraph office at 9 in the morning, and Clara held it in her hands and read her grandmother's name on it, and felt something move through her that she did not try to name and did not try to stop. Janet Oakes came with them to the courthouse on Monday morning. She had not been asked. She appeared at Clara's door at 7 in the morning, in her good dress, with her jaw set, and said, "I'm coming." And Clara said, "I know." And that was the end of it. Ethan was at the door 2 minutes later. He saw Janet. He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Oakes." "Mr. Cole," Janet said, "let's go take back what's hers." The county courtroom was not large. It did not need to be for what happened inside it, which took less than 40 minutes from start to finish and had the compressed, irreversible quality of something that had been a long time building. Aldous Greer was there with 2 men who were presumably lawyers, well-dressed and confident in the way of men who have appeared before this particular judge before and found it agreeable. Roy Greer sat behind them. Warren Pruitt sat behind Roy. Mabel Pruitt had not come, which Clara noted and set aside. The judge was a thin man named Harker, who had the manner of someone who had heard most things twice already and was not impressed by the first telling. He called the petition, and Greer's lawyer stood up and laid it out: abandoned property, no documented claim. County custody, very orderly, very smooth. Then Judge Harker looked at Clara. "Mrs. Whitmore, you have a response." Clara stood. She had dressed carefully that morning not to impress, but because the occasion required it, and she respected occasions that required things. She placed the federal certified copy on the bar in front of the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "I have a certified copy of the territorial land filing made by my grandmother Margaret Holt with the Federal Territorial Land Office in 1851. The document bears the federal seal and the signature of the territorial land agent." She paused. The property in question was registered with the county assessor's office by Aldous Greer in 1874, 23 years after the original federal filing, without any record of a legitimate transfer from my grandmother or her estate. She looked at the judge directly. "The federal record is the controlling document. The county registration is superseded by it, and the absence of any transfer document means Mr. Greer's registration constitutes fraud." Silence in the courtroom. Greer's lawyer said something about county jurisdiction. Judge Harker looked at him with the expression of a man who has heard most things twice and found this particular version deeply unimpressive. "A federal territorial deed predates and supersedes county registration," Harker said. "That is not ambiguous." He looked at the certified copy. He looked at Greer. He looked back at the copy. "This petition is denied. The property identified in the 1851 territorial filing belongs to the estate of Margaret Holt, and by inheritance to Clara Whitmore, and any conflicting county registration is void." He set the paper down. "And I'm going to be sending a note to Arthur Briggs at the Federal Land Office, because this is not the first time the name Greer has appeared in this courtroom in a context I find worth examining." Aldous Greer stood up. Judge Harker looked at him. "Sit down, Mr. Greer," he said without raising his voice at all. Greer sat down. It was over. Not everything. Not immediately. Briggs's warrant came through 4 days later, and Aldous Greer was taken into federal custody before he could reach the territorial border. And Roy Greer followed him a week after that. And the county assessor who had been feeding Greer information from the inside resigned without being asked, and left Ridgeline on a Tuesday with no forwarding address. The case Ethan had built across 3 counties over 4 years went to a federal court in the spring, and 14 families were included in the restitution proceedings, which took longer than anyone wanted, but moved with the slow, unstoppable weight of things that are simply correct. But in the courtroom on that Monday morning, when Judge Harker's gavel came down, Clara Whitmore stood up from her chair and did not shake at all. Janet Oakes put her hand on Clara's arm and squeezed it once hard, and said nothing, which was exactly right. Ethan stood beside her and held his hat in both hands, and looked at her with the full and unmanaged expression of a man who no longer has any interest in managing his expressions around this particular woman. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said. "My grandmother," Clara said, "would have done it herself and not needed to wait for a loose floorboard to give her the deed." She picked up her bag. "But I'll take what I can get." He laughed. She had not heard him laugh fully before the real version, not the small corner-of-the-mouth thing, and it was the best sound she had heard since the day she learned bread could come out golden instead of dense, which was the day she had learned she might survive after all. They walked out of the courthouse into the cold December air, and Ridgeline was there, the same as it always was, the same store and the same road, and the same particular quality of sky over Wyoming that went from gray to gold in the space of a breath. Some of the same people on the street who had been talking about her for 3 years. Some of them looked. Most of them looked away. Warren Pruitt was standing near the courthouse steps. He looked at Clara as she came out, and then looked at his boots, and then looked back at her. And she could see the complicated and uncomfortable arithmetic happening behind his eyes. The ledger of a man who had been wrong in a public and irreversible way, and was beginning to understand what that was going to cost him in the long accounting. Clara looked at him for a moment. "Good morning, Warren," she said pleasantly, and kept walking because she was done performing her grudges for other people's comfort, and she was done performing her grace for them either. She walked back to her house, her grandmother's house on her grandmother's land, and she started the bread. Ethan came in and rolled up his sleeves without being asked, and fixed the back porch step with the nails he had in his saddlebag, and the competence of a man who has always been better at doing than at saying. She could hear him working while she worked the small, precise sounds of it. And they were in the same house, doing the same work, in the same easy silence, that she had come to understand was not absence, but presence the fullest kind. When the bread was in, and the step was fixed, he came into the kitchen and washed his hands at the basin, and sat at the table, and she poured the coffee and sat across from him, and they were quiet together, in the way that had become the truest thing about them. Earned, not given, built out of flour-dusted mornings, and cold porches, and a tin box under a floorboard, and 400 miles of honest road. "The step's fixed," he said. "I heard," she said. He picked up his coffee. "There's a fence line along the eastern creek boundary that's going to need posting once the land is formally back in your name." "I know. That's a two-person job." "I know that too," she said. He looked at her across the table. "Clara." She looked at him. Yes, it was not a question, and they both knew it, and he smiled the full smile that changed his whole face, and she felt it move through her the same way it always had, like the first warm morning after a long winter, sudden and real and worth every cold day that came before it. Outside, Ridgeline would talk. It always would. Some people would come around and some wouldn't, and the ones who didn't weren't worth the grief of it. The courthouse had said its piece. Briggs would say the rest in a federal court in the spring. The bread would be ready in an hour, and it would be the best she had made, yet better than the batch that had drawn a stranger to her back door on an October morning and changed the whole shape of everything, because she was no longer baking to survive, and she was no longer humming to keep the quiet from getting too loud. She was humming because she meant it. She was baking because this was her kitchen, and her land, and her life won back from a man who had counted on her not knowing what she had. And she knew exactly what she had. Now, every acre of it, every board of it, every morning of it, including this one, including the man across the table from her, who had followed a fraudster's trail across 3 counties, and stopped at her door because of bread, and stayed because of something neither of them had needed to name out loud to know was real. Clara Whitmore had built her life back from I.O.U.S., and a letter from Cheyenne, and a cold kitchen, and 3 years of managing fine, and she had done it the way she did everything, with her hands, with her head, and with the particular stubbornness of a woman who understood that the difference between surviving and living was not luck, was not rescue, was not a man on a porch who said the right things at the right moment. It was choosing every morning to begin again. And every morning from then on, as the sun came up over Wyoming and the bread came out golden, and Ethan Cole took the first bite and smiled at her across the table, like a man who had finally found the place he was going to stop, Clara chose. That was enough. That was everything. That was hers.